Amidst all the new characters coming out, something the player base has noticed that's been happening rather unsubtly is that unlike Genshin Impact where meta-defining units are released very sparingly, Honkai Star Rail's first wave of characters are among the most powerful even for the very limited scope of the game. It feels almost as if each one is better than the next. As someone who hasn't played Honkai 3rd, I'm not sure if the same took place over there when the game first came out, but Star Rail's definitely taking a very cavalier approach to power scaling, especially early on in the game's timeline. It's not unusual for developers to be so flippant about character strength, mostly due to lack of an established benchmark. With so few units and so many areas yet to be filled in, it's extremely likely for characters to come out either very strong or very weak. But since MiHoYo's games are known for drawing a huge amount of reverence towards units, and in light of previous experiences where disgruntled players aggressively express their frustrations to MiHoYo for making their favorite units underpowered, it is in their best interest to err on the side of characters being too strong than too weak, if nothing else then for the sake of good sales. Version 1 saw the release of Scylla and Jinyuan, a Hunt and Erudition unit respectively, and as the first event banners they set the standard for what to weigh future units against. Then in version 1.1 we saw Locha and Silverwolf, two support units that complemented many players' rosters and will likely do so till the end of time. Version 1.2 onwards is when things started to turn towards a certain direction, and that's what this video is about. Today I'll be discussing the rise of destruction units, and how their sudden yet dominating presence might set the wrong precedent for the game. If there's one thing that we culture gamers agree on though, it's that destruction is perfectly fine if it's done by pretty characters, and with that I present you with Goddess of Victory Nikke. You guys might recognize this game seeing as my editor usually uses background footage of it whenever I talk about other gacha games. Well, now I have the pleasure of actually being sponsored by them. Nikke is a 2D sci-fi shooter RPG where just like in Star Rail and Genshin you get to pull for characters who happen to all be female, so yes, it's a waifu game, of which you can deploy 5 at a time distributed across a horizontal row in a third-person shooter style format, combining real-time and before turn-based strategy into a unique take on this kind of genre. Having just kicked off their 1-year anniversary, they have a lot of new events, content, and rewards for everyone to enjoy, including but not limited to the new story event Red Ash, featuring Red Hood with full voices, tons of CG, and an entire new minigame that's very reminiscent of Survivor.io. In addition, they're expanding on the permanent content, unlocking chapters 25 and 26, as well as the new boss and develop system. And to celebrate their 1-year anniversary, they're giving away tons of free pulls, upwards of 75 vouchers, and a free daily pull throughout the entirety of it. They actually released their 1-year anniversary livestream just over a week ago if you want to watch it on YouTube for more detail. Outside of the game, Nikke is expected to release 4 animes over the next year, so for those of you like myself who love it when games release anime shorts or adaptations, keep watch for that. Be sure to use the link on screen, which is also in the description below, and give Nikke a try. It's available on mobile devices and Windows just like Genshin and Star Rail, so if you're big on gacha games and haven't tried this one yet, now's as good a time as any. Thanks again to Goddess of Victory Nikke for sponsoring the video, but for now let's get back to talking about destruction units. A governing rule that determines whether a gacha game can withstand the test of time is the careful balance of its content and the means of completing said content. It doesn't matter how difficult or overtuned you make a boss fight or dungeon so long as there's a variety of efficient ways for the player to undergo and complete it. Should the content be too difficult for anyone who isn't a whale, it can push those out of the game as they find it more trouble than it's worth. But if the content proves to be too trivial, that can also have the adverse effect of inciting boredom, owing to the absence of any stimulating challenge. Therefore, the goal is to make the game challenging without necessarily making it difficult. And to add on to that, said challenge should be as strategy diverse as possible, so that it doesn't just boil down to reading a guide on how to complete it. It's a lot harder to pull this off than one would think. By giving the player too much freedom, that can compromise challenge, restrict the number of ways you can complete something, and that can also have a counterproductive effect. The means of completing Honkai Star Rail's content lies in the foundation of team compositions, just like in Genshin and Honkai 3rd. How well you can gear up your party members to deal sufficient amounts of damage at a fast enough rate while being prepared for the enemy unit's attempts to try and stop you. Presently, you have 2 roles, damage and support, with the latter role being sectioned off into offensive and defensive supports respectively. The game categorizes its units into 7 different paths, which are basically classes: Destruction, Hunt, Erudition, Harmony, Nihility, Preservation, and Abundance. The first 3 comprise your damage roles, with Destruction specializing in general DPS, while Hunt and Erudition specialize in single target and multi-target output respectively. The notion of designating one's damage output based on the number of targets they can attack at once is a very frequent sight across all games, not just turn-based combat but in action RPGs, MMOs, even genres like MOBAs or first-person shooters. For instance, in an FPS, the sniper rifle is traditionally regarded as the single target killer with precision and range far surpassing that of any other firearm at the expense of area coverage and reload time. Meanwhile, something like a minigun has tremendous area coverage and destructive power, sacrificing accuracy and range in the process. The benefit of creating distinct applications for classes or weapons is to prevent, and more importantly, discourage redundancy and monotony. That is the motivation for any and all semblance of classification in any game ever made. Why are there 18 types in Pokemon? Because if there's only one type, that would make the game repetitive very fast. And so they balance types around, or at least try to make it so no one type dominates the entire game, incentivizing or sometimes obligating the player to diversify their roster and adapt to the situation at hand. Done correctly, this can extend the lifespan of a game by allowing developers to introduce content laterally instead of vertically. If they wanted to introduce a new generation of bosses or dungeons, they can make one for Type A, one for Type B, etc. Star Rail's diversification lies in its elements and paths. Regarding elements, I feel like it's less pronounced of a mechanic as opposed to how it is in Genshin. Realistically, the only aspect the element is responsible for is whether it can break enemy toughness gauges. At the moment, there's not a clear enough disparity in power between the 7 elements to put one above all others yet. And as demonstrated by Jingliu, even though the freeze debuff can potentially hinder her performance, 9 times out of 10 she couldn't care less and will decimate everything to pieces anyway. That leaves us with just the 3 damage paths, Destruction, Hunt, and Erudition, which means we should probably address what the potential keyword potential issue might be. To reiterate, the Hunt path mainly focuses on single target damage, concentrating a unit's power to zero in on one enemy and take them down quickly. Meanwhile, the Erudition path focuses on multi-target damage, allowing them to wipe out entire waves of enemies in record time. Were it just those two, there would be a nice and simple balance, with one role dealing with ABC problems and the other dealing with XYZ problems. However, there's a third DPS path, Destruction. While Hunt and Erudition have very discernible functions, Destruction is more ambiguous. Thematically, those who follow the path of Destruction admire recklessness, anger, and destructive behavior. Wow, who could have thought? Gameplay-wise, Destruction units are meant to, and I quote, deal outstanding amounts of damage and possess great survivability, making them suitable for various combat scenarios. I guess to make an analogy, if a sniper rifle represents Hunt and a minigun represents Erudition, then an RPG represents Destruction. It doesn't really have a specific purpose, it just destroys everything caught in the blast radius, making it more indiscriminate as well. It can harm foe or friend. How that translates to Star Rail's mechanics is that Destruction units are capable of dealing damage but are also expected to take damage as well. We can see this in a multitude of ways. Clara is a counterattack fighter who draws enemy aggro and enables her to strike back every time she's hit, with the idea that she will ultimately come out on top. Blade drains his own health to deal damage and amplify the strength of his ultimate, allowing him to dish out staggering damage to enemies. And most recently, we have Jingliu, who sacrifices her entire party's health to boost her attack strength, making her operate in a similar fashion to how Blade injures himself. Now, the other way Destruction distinguishes itself, and the way that I think applies to the majority of the cast, as evident by Physical Trailblazer demonstrating this, is that it deals damage in the middle of Hunt and Erudition. Literally, Hunt focuses on one enemy, Erudition focuses on large groups of enemies, Destruction focuses on small groups of enemies. In any given fight, the most enemies you can encounter are 5. As such, attacks in Star Rail are split off into 3 different types: Single Target, AoE, and Blast. The first 2 are self-explanatory, but what is Blast? Blast attacks are moves that deal damage to a primary target, then a reduced amount to adjacent enemies, giving the user a modicum of area coverage but not at the expense of single target damage. At a surface level, this may appear rather inoffensive. There are some fights where you only need to fight one enemy, some where you might have to clear multiple enemies, and some where you might have to only fight 2 or 3. So there should still be a proper separation of the classes. That would be true if there was in fact a proper separation, but in reality there isn't. I'd like to clarify that this kind of does have to do with there not being enough Hunt and Erudition units to really solidify the separation of roles though, but I'll get more into that as we go through the video. Blast DPS is currently the most efficient form of damage output, practically beating out single target and AoE damage at the same time. The whole premise of Hunt units is that by sacrificing the ability to attack multiple targets at a time, they can do more damage than either Destruction or Erudition units when fighting an isolated enemy. And though that is true on paper, there are very few instances in this game where you're truly fighting just one enemy. Take the 3 Echo of War bosses. The Doomsday Beast's first phase begins with the Denshin Core and 2 sidearms, requiring you to strike down all 3 of them before you can attack the boss itself. This puts units like Seela, Topaz, and Yanqing at a massive disadvantage, as they can only attack one enemy at a time, thus making it take noticeably longer for them to clear this type of enemy. That can extend to Cocolia and Vantilia as well, both of which can summon enemies mid-battle to increase their threat capacity and or hinder your own actions, so it's in your best interest to get rid of the adds as fast as possible so as not to escalate the fight's difficulty any more than necessary. Once again, Hunt units will have an exceedingly harder time against bosses who can summon even 1 extra enemy, let alone 2 or 3. In the case of Seela, she's kind of an exception. The extra action afforded to her whenever she scores a killing blow on an enemy can enable her to deal with that more comfortably than her peers can. But that's only under the assumption that you can one-shot them, and unless you really deck her out, that's easier said than done. Either way, those turns you spend clearing mooks are turns spent not attacking the main boss, so your DPS will suffer either way. In that case, Erudition units are the way to go, yes? Erudition units care little about the number of enemies. Whether 1 or 5, they can dish out their combo all the same. Very true, but in accordance to their path designation, Erudition units have comparatively poor single target damage. You might clear enemy spawns as soon as they come out, but the few turns to bosses on their own, you're doing measurably worse DPS than your Hunt counterparts. That brings us to Destruction and the aforementioned Blast Attack. Not counting external buffs and just comparing individual skill to individual skill, blast attacks deal just as much damage to the primary enemy as single target attacks do, but they also deal damage to adjacent enemies in the process, enabling them to achieve the simultaneous goal of clearing undesirable spawns while damaging the main boss. This makes blast attacks on average better than single targets since right now, the majority of content in Star Rail usually has more than one enemy. Additionally, blast attacks are also better than AoE ones too. How so? Take a look at this graphic on screen that I'm gonna force my editor to make because I'm a nice guy. When you have 5 enemies on field with the boss standing right in the middle, if you use a blast attack to damage the boss and clear the 2 enemies next to it, when they die, the remaining 2 enemies on the far ends will automatically reposition to now be adjacent to the boss, meaning the second blast attack will work just the same. Though this means you'll have to attack twice to eventually clear everything, bear in mind you're still actively damaging the boss. A Hunt unit will have to expend at minimum 4 turns to clear the surrounding minions. That's 4 turns and not damaging the main boss. This is somewhat alleviated by Hunt units possessing higher base speed to let them act more often than the other 2 classes, but unless you literally have double the number of turns of a Destruction unit, you're still wasting turns overall. An Erudition unit will only spend ideally 1 turn clearing them, but they won't be doing as much damage to the main target as a Hunt or Destruction unit, making Destruction theoretically superior to Hunt or Erudition in combat, which we're beginning to notice even with the few characters we have so far. Super Dan Heng and Jingliu rank among the top 2 best damage dealers in the game in virtually every scenario one can think of, with their only real competition in any of these departments being Kafka and Scylla, the former basically doubling as a Destruction unit if we go by area coverage, and the latter being, let's be honest, the fakest Hunt unit in the game on account of her turn reset potential. As for Blade, though he's not quite up there, he makes up for it by being an HP scaler, so he's less prone to exploding against enemy burst damage, which is more valuable than you would think. Of course, much of that can be attributed to MiHoYo being ever so generous with their damage numbers, but even if they weren't overly indulgent, they would still be more practical than the other damage dealers we have so far. If we really want to split hairs, Scylla's damage ceiling can more than keep up with Dan Heng or Jingliu, but the deck is still stacked against her in light of her only being allowed to strike 1 enemy at a time, even in spite of her reset mechanic. Towards endgame content like Swarm Disaster, there's nary a reason for players to prioritize a Hunt or Erudition unit over Destruction since they're actively hamstringing themselves in the process. Granted, in their defense, once you start stacking Blessings and Curios, hypercarries like Scylla can myrtleize the living daylights out of most bosses with their sheer burst damage, especially in tandem with Bronya, Tingyun, Silver Wolf and whatnot. But right now, in areas like Memory of Chaos, blast damage is just the most consistent way of dealing with content right now, so Scylla's mostly being held back by the conventional traits of her path. Plus, whatever investments necessary to bring her to that level could be given to Destruction units for greater payoff in the long term. No disrespect to Scylla mains, mind you, I still think she's a top tier character. That being said, one could argue that this quote-unquote problem is almost entirely circumstantial and can easily change at the drop of a hat. The only reason Destruction units are pushing down Hunt and Erudition right now is because most of the damage dealers released in the past few versions have all been Destruction, and egregiously overtuned at that. MiHoYo could release more Hunt and Erudition units that have ways to either spread their damage across multiple enemies or condense their AoE damage into one, and there's a proof of concept for that. Jingliu's E1 increases her damage output when she's only attacking 1 enemy, so there's nothing stopping them from allowing an Erudition unit to pack in 5 enemies worth of damage onto a single character. But at that point, it defeats the purpose of having 3 separate DPS paths, if Hunt units can clear 5 enemy groups just as easily as an Erudition unit can and vice versa. Alternatively, they can just give Hunt units 10 times more damage against a single target to really drive home the point that against 1 enemy, you have to use a Hunt character. The case of most bosses and enemies having adjacent spawns and nerfing Hunt units could easily be fixed by including bosses in the future that fly completely solo. That's a valid point, but as a reminder, at the current moment, the damage ceiling of Destruction units are mostly on par with Hunt units even against a single target. So if anything, that only further incentivizes Destruction over Hunt in most scenarios. On the other hand, creating a multi-part boss where there are 5 parts to it but all of them share the same health bar, that could definitely be a way they can give Erudition units more equity. In fact, I think that might be the only way they can do so, since enemies reposition after being defeated. To allow Erudition units a noticeable advantage against bosses is to make it so that there's perpetually 5 targets. There are solutions to this predicament. It's not like this issue will affect the game hereafter until the end of time. That being said, the dominance of Destruction units is causing players to view Hunt and Erudition as inferior right now, which may influence the sales and popularity of future units in either field. I'm kind of already seeing it with Topaz. Her exclusive single target nature backfires on her, making her feel more like a sub DPS that boosts follow-up attack damage. So despite being a DPS character, she feels more like a support. Inevitably, there will be moments throughout Star Rail's timeline where one path is stronger than the other based on what units are available and the content at the time. But I hope the developers notice that the way this game is structured right now is veering way too much in favor of destruction, and it would be in Star Rail's best interest for all 3 paths to have their own unique pros and cons. Right now, we're very much in a destruction-centric meta. Not a bad thing if it's only for a transient period of time, but something that had me concerned, especially since the game is still young. Anyways, that's gonna be it for today. Let me know your thoughts on this topic in the comments down below, whether you agree or disagree with my points. Aside from that, if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other Honkai Star Rail content if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.